Good morning, everyone. Today we're talking about business analysis and agile. And the agenda here is not much to look at, but I'm going to try to not just make this a rehash of what agile is, but we are going to touch on agile and the classic Scrum team or the Agile team and what the thinking is there. And then we're going to talk about requirements ownership. Because whether you call it agile, whether you do waterfall, whether you do hybrid, or if you do anything in between, requirements is a core part of project work. And managing those requirements is a critical part of project success. So we're going to talk about what is the role of a business analyst and where does it fit into the agile team as agile continues to become more and more popular. I see a growing gap in the space where business analysis is often forgotten or doesn't have a clear owner. And that's really the topic of this discussion. So just to touch lightly on Agile, Agile is more or less a set of principles. It's organized in a manifesto. And I put some things here where if you look at what is it, it's a body of knowledge that helps culturally guide an organization to run project processes in a certain way. And if you look at the Agile onion on the left-hand side, it can be manifested. Agile can be manifested, that is, in tools and processes, all the way through practices, principles, values, and ultimately the mindset for the entire company. And if you look at how an agile organization wants to be, in most cases, the tools and processes are the more visible and less powerful pieces. And as you combine it, as you go through this onion model, at least, you get to the less visible but the arguably more powerful parts where everyone is thinking agile, everyone works in agile principles and how they work, how they do projects, and it really seeps through everything they do. It's kind of similar to if you've ever thought about the whole lean culture and people want everyone to have process improvement mindset. Agile is very much in that vein, and companies can have a lot of success if they cultivate an agile mindset. And the four key agile values, you can look up a ton of these different models now in terms of summarizing the manifesto, but just to level set, I picked this one. I think it serves as a representation of agile's spirit just as much as anything else. But agile really, especially over waterfall, which you could say is its direct competitive PM methodology, it prioritizes individuals and the interactions over processes and tools, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, working software over comprehensive documentation, and responding to change over following a plan. And in general, I want everyone to know my stance that I completely agree with what I'll casually call the agile revolution. I think being more iterative and having less focus on documentation, less focus on processes and tools over the interactivity. These are all great things as a flyby guide. And I think if you follow this, you will end up having better project results than if you err on the other side, which is, hey, let's follow a rigorous process where we do tons of documentation and this and that. But one is not, it doesn't mean that just by following this you and losing a lot of the rigor that came before, it's going to create a good result. It has to be applied in your context. And that's why I think the whole business analysis conversation is so critical, because a lot of people equate comprehensive and heavy documentation to business analysis. They equate business analysis to the process and tools and, making plans and a lot of the project management pieces. And in that way, we don't want to mistakenly use agile as a justification to remove a lot of the foundational rigor that makes a project successful. Because ultimately, agile is a software development methodology. And you could say it's other types of methodology too, but I'm really trying to build this narrative continuity, because if we think about what we struggle with today, the vast majority of projects and initiatives and programs are all software driven. They're all technology driven. We're in a massive digitization context within the marketplace. And if you think about what agile is being used for, it's being applied as a principle to inform a software development methodology in the majority of its use cases. And in that regard, again, the principles of having the product backlog, breaking things into smaller sprints, making sure that you have constant communication with the product owner as a means to course correct requirements is excellent strategy. But it doesn't change the fact that it is a software development methodology, and the software development lifecycle at its core is still going to apply. And I've pulled this up, and again, there's a lot of different ways where people can define the software development lifecycle. But if you look at it generally as identifying business problems, articulating them, and then the second step, which I've highlighted here, which is creating business and functional requirements, these are inviolate in my professional opinion. You can't go through an SDLC, no matter what methodology you're using, Agile or other, without going through these basic steps, which is identifying problems, developing requirements, solutioning based on the scope, constraints, and requirements, and then building technology against those requirements. And you can window dress that process all you want, but the point is, if you lose your fundamental connectivity with these basics and this sort of raw process of how software needs to be developed or how really problems need to be decomposed and solved, you're going to get into really muddy water. And so the question is in Agile, if you're following my narrative here, where is the business analysis? Where is it expected to happen? And who is expected to own it? And I think this is becoming, in the field at least, one of the biggest problems with applying the Agile methodology. What I've shown here is the classic Agile Scrum team. And when you look at the roles that they talk about, they really try to skinny it down. So the project team doesn't include formal business analysis, but you have the product owner who is supposed to, and then on the right, you see the circles I have on the left I'm referring to, but then on the right-hand side, there's some basic breakdown of the high-level roles that these folks play in Agile. But you have the product owner who is really ultimately responsible for the user stories, accepting the criteria and the acceptance criteria, product vision, and just basically owning what the business accountability is for what they're trying to develop or what we're trying to achieve. And then the Scrum Master is your PM, and they're supposed to be looking at the project process itself and driving down costs and increasing efficiency. So pretty much a traditional PM accountability there. And then the dev team, and or the team, if you want to call it that in Agile, which is the people who are doing the work. They're actually making the code, they're building the solution, they're absorbing the requirements through the user stories, and they're putting out the product. And Agile's whole thing was that these folks are supposed to, if they stay really close in touch and there's constant communication, then you're going to be able to iterate quickly to the right product, effectively lessening your burden of very heavy documentation and all the rigmarole that came with the waterfall period in project management. But again, it really is tough because the requirements ownership in this model ends up being very muddy. And I think part of that is because the product owner and this triangle and this constant communication that Agile is supposed to be teaching, where people started to have trouble getting traction in application, was it doesn't really scale for every scale of organization. To think that for every project, big and small, anything from one team, maybe a few $1,000s, to multiple departments in an enterprise organization and project budgets of millions of dollars, that you would still be able to maintain this type of team structure where you have product owner, team, and scrum master. Because what I've highlighted here, even in this basic breakdown, the product owner owns the user stories, which is essentially the Agile container for requirements. The team is supposed to be decomposing those stories, and the scrum master can even help write stories. And some of that might be different from where you look at different team roles or not. But ultimately, even in this simple example, there is no requirements ownership. And it's causing a lot of problems because the product owner in big organizations often has the vision, sure, but can they write requirements sufficient to be developed? The reality is typically not. And then when you start to have that responsibility floating around, you definitely don't want the people developing also writing their own requirements or decomposing them with any sort of tangible control over what they look like in the final product. Because then we have a fundamental lack of accountability where you have the person who's building the thing defining what the thing is, and nobody wants that. And then also the Scrum Master, the PM, at least in my training and my career, you never want your PM also playing a hybrid BA role unless they're very mature and they can keep those roles with integrity. Because again, the PM is supposed to be reporting and driving the requirements completion. There's an inherent conflict of interest if the PM is also writing the requirements and signing off on them, because their desire to get things done quickly and drive the project cost down is going to come at odds with having the requirements meet the business objective. So there was a lot of things that over decades of project management, PMI and the original PMs thought about this and said the users, the requirements have to be managed in a certain way with certain lines drawn so that the integrity of what the business needs can actually get through development. And again, Agile has done a really great job of moving that conversation forward. But this piece is getting really lost, and we're actually going backward in a lot of the consulting situations that I've seen over the last, decade of watching Agile. When you think about, okay, without somebody firmly owning these requirements with a skill set and a focus to manage it, they're not getting done and they're sloppy. And 100 Agile sprints that doesn't get to a result because the requirements are muddy is not going to end up being more efficient than having a BA and doing maybe even a more traditional waterfall approach. If you don't have poor requirements, you're going to have a lot of bad things happen on the project, no matter what method you use. And just to have it here to look at, poorly structured requirements documents come from no requirements ownership. I guess what I'm really trying to say here is if you have no one owning requirements, you're certainly going to have poorly structured documents or none at all. Poorly written requirements, certainly. And that, again, in the Agile context is your user stories are going to be not great quality. You're going to have a hard time validating or testing them because who owns them? Who owns the validation and testing if nobody owns the business requirements writing? Technically, in Agile, you have the product owner who's supposed to be the person who's accountable for validating whether the requirements were executed correctly. But if they didn't write them, then how is that going to work? Poor customer involvement, poor prioritization, poor change management. There's a lot of this stuff we know classically if you've been doing PM or IT work for a long time, that if the requirements are bad, it's garbage in, garbage out all day long. And if you set up a project team where no one's owning the requirements, then they're definitely going to be garbage. And I've never seen a way to avoid that. And a lot of times what ends up happening is people start figuring out on Agile projects who somebody ends up stepping up and owning them because they can't be avoided in the SDLC. So when I talk about owning a requirement, I'm just threw up this visual so we know what I'm talking about. This is just purely about requirements management here. And this is all the stuff that needs to get done in an Agile project regardless of an owner. But you've got to scope the requirements effort, you've got to plan for it, you've got to elicit those requirements from somewhere or somebody, and you have to document them. Even if it's not heavy documentation, we don't have to go back to BRDs, we don't have to go back to 30-page documents that go over every single requirement and nauseating detail, functional, technical, whatever. But you got to write them down. You cannot have a project of any amount of Agile or other that has no documented requirements. Then there's no way to create change logs. There's no way to hold anyone accountable. There's no traceability. So this idea of light documentation, I'm all about it, but it has to be some documentation that you can use to manage the requirements. And then typically the requirements, once they're documented, somebody has to own their analysis, deriving insights, creating solutions, and managing them through testing and execution. And this is the requirements lifecycle that somebody has to own. So when I say owning a requirement, and owning the requirements lifecycle, I'm talking about this whole piece here. And there's really no Agile role. Also, I put this in here again as a reminder to all about the classic BA role and responsibilities. I'm not going to go over these in detail, but if anyone wants a copy of these slides, I'll mention again at the end, you can send it to me. This is pretty typical BA stuff if you look at the BA Book of Knowledge online. But I'm just reminding, in the classic sense, this role takes on a lot of different functions. And really, this is just the written version of, if you go back to this slide I was just talking about, all the activities that are in this life cycle of a requirement are what used to be the old BA's role, and they have to go somewhere. And just a visual of these last few slides, a business analyst, a strong one, would be expected to map the process out, really create that scope. That's that scoping piece of what requirements do we need to do, cast a net over it, create user stories, use cases, and ultimately, depending on the project and the detail required, break it down to line item. And what I'm saying is this takes a lot of skills, and there's not a skill set that a single Agile role calls for that would have all these skills. And that's why, again, you're seeing this growing trend of the accountability for doing these activities. Either the activities aren't getting done or it gets dispersed among the Agile team. Because this is more realistically what, at least in any sort of medium or scaled out organization, the Agile team ends up looking like. So you have in the inner circle there the traditional PM, Scrum Master, product owner, and dev team. But ultimately, the product owner may be reporting to a business owner or somebody who's accountable at a higher level for a larger effort. And that business owner is trying to manage the expectations against the program or portfolio with multiple stakeholders. And there's a business contingent that actually typically owns the accountability for the business outcome or whatever the product is they're trying to build. You can say there has to be a single product owner all you want, and I believe that you have to have a clear single point of accountability, but that product owner in reality in a bigger organization has to be absorbing data from multiple other stakeholders to make sure they're in alignment. And then on the other side, you've got SMEs, technical, the people actually on the ground doing the operating, the source of a lot of the requirements. In a larger project in Agile, you can't expect the product owner to have all of the knowledge, the dev team to have all the knowledge to have a bigger effort. And again, this is not me lobbying for, okay, we have to sit down and elicit heavy requirements from every stakeholder who's involved and create these giant requirements documents. But the reality is the Scrum team has to extend out into the organization, or you're not going to be able to get all the requirements information you need to execute appropriately. So what I'm pointing out here is even this expanded team diagram, it still doesn't have any solid lines. You've got SMEs who have to contribute, you've got people beside the product owner that have to contribute, but ultimately we have to have more accountability and firmer lines to make sure requirements are being managed. And that's kind of the culmination of what we're here to talk about, which is the BA still has a role. And again, I'm very sensitive. You hear me repeating these phrases about, I'm not trying to trigger PTSD or trauma in people who had to do BRDs for 15 or 20 years. You can call the role whatever you want, but the BA is in the team. Either that button there that you see in the middle, the BA is going to end up somewhere dispersed in there, or the product owner is the product owner slash BA, or the Scrum Master is the Scrum Master slash BA, or the dev team, unfortunately, ends up doing a lot of the BA's job. But the more you can kind of integrate what is the traditional requirements lifecycle management into one role, the more successful your project outcomes are going to be. Because then you have somebody with consistent attention and focus to making sure that all those things are documented, traced, validated, and then tested and ultimately deployed. And it does not mean that should take away from the Scrum Master, product owner, or dev team. In my experience, a strong Agile effort has all of those with integrity, but a BA is in there to supplement and can still maintain their own role and their own accountability. Because you don't want people wearing multiple hats. We want to have good conversation. We want to have strong sprint cycles. We want to have a lot of the things that Agile has to offer, which largely those stronger, more iterations and shorter cycles. But it does not mean that we don't need formal requirements management. And that's really what I wanted to share with you guys today in this discussion. And just to summarize, Agile focuses on quick iterations, less documentation, and direct access to the product owner, all extremely important. But the current Agile team does not prescribe dedicated requirements ownership, which is really hurting and impeding progress in a lot of Agile projects and a lot of Agile cultures. Requirements management, no matter what you want to say, remains a critical part of the SDLC, and that's regardless of whether you're Agile or using some other method. And if you're going to have requirements that need to be managed, you need skilled resources to do it. And the more you can train a resource, whatever resource you have, and say, this is the requirements management lifecycle, and you are expected to have the skills and the knowledge to own it, is going to help your project work no matter what you're doing. And that really culminates in this BA role idea that everything it classically has owned and still should continue to roll. I do believe this is a skill set that needs to be cultivated. It needs to have more attention, not less. And it should be a formal role in any Agile Scrum team if you want to optimize your sprints. And it brings up one last point that I'll just kind of add on here so you can get my unsolicited 2 cents. I think a lot too culturally has happened with business analysis, where there was a ton of business analysts out there and it was a very ubiquitous role title, but it often was a net that captured not a really standard or consistent skill set, which made a lot of people lose confidence in BAs. You could hire a BA and get a really strong BA and have great results, or you could hire a BA and get a very weak BA and have terrible results. I think business analysis, like all things, it's a complicated role in projects and organizations, because a lot of times if they're not given strong guidance, they're not strong enough from a business maturity perspective to slot their skill set in where it needs to be and just find their way around the project team or find their way around the business group to make sure that their skills are being utilized heavily, which is why I think it's very important for project managers and people who are organizing the teams and accountable for execution to know that the skill set is needed, find the skill set in their organization or externally, and make sure it's being deployed to high effect. Because if you're thinking, I've worked with business analysts in the past and they're a dime a dozen and they don't really get the job done, a lot of times it's because they haven't been cultivated to be fit in properly, or they haven't been given the runway, in my experience at least. So just my 2 cents to tie this all together. So with that, we have a few minutes left over at the end here for questions. Also, again, if you want to send me an email after, I'm happy to share the slides. So right now, I will open it up for the group. If you have any questions or comments, now is the time.
What is the role of project manager over this organization?
Great question. So in terms of the Agile team we talked about, the Scrum Master is, at least in the Scrum curriculum, is the traditional project manager role. And project manager, their role to me is always to own the project process. And when I talk about owning the project process, when you set up a project, regardless of what you're trying to get done, the project manager is setting up how it will be done, the resources used from a human resource standpoint, but also if there's any direct resources, funding, budget, whatever it is, the project manager is taking those constraints and they're trying to drive that process to completion in the most effective way possible. So ultimately, the project manager is accountable for the ROI of the project getting executed within the requirements that are set out to be done. So in Agile, it's no different. If I'm the Scrum Master or if I'm the project manager's main objective should be to be watching that the scheduling is happening, watching that the parties are coordinating, looking out for any roadblocks that can materially change how the effort is progressing, and trying to make sure that we're driving the project to completion within the expectations of the organization. And in that regard, I've always lobbied pretty heavily that that should not be conflated with managing requirements, writing requirements, executing things. If the project manager is doing their job right, they should really have their hands full with just making sure that the processes done by the execution team and the product owner, that they're coordinating and that all that's happening in the right cadence and at the right cost. So I think that answers the question, but please let me know if there's more follow-up there.
Great. Thank you, Sam. We also do have another question. David asked, good presentation. How much does institutional knowledge play in a generic agile or waterfall process?
Ugh. How much does it play? More than it should is my direct answer. In my opinion, institutional knowledge, and really what also you could call tribal knowledge, if I'm understanding the question correctly, should not really impact good project methodology. I believe that, institutional knowledge, depending on the terminology, the taxonomy you use, maybe what you call roles, maybe your organization has found certain ways to allocate responsibility across different functions and in different scales. But ultimately, you should always be able to clearly define best practice. And best practice being whether you're doing waterfall or you're doing agile or you're doing some sort of hybrid, you should be able to clearly articulate what the process is so that a newcomer who comes from outside the organization doesn't have some sort of massive learning curve, or they're not relearning some strange proprietary version of project management to fulfill the organization's requirements. I've never really seen a situation where somebody runs project management better than you can definitely adapt, but if you rely on institutional knowledge to make it work, even if you found a better configuration, because project work is always taking people in and out of the team, and you're hiring new team members, you're working with vendors, any sort of edge you may think you get on using institutional knowledge is going to be negated, and probably negated more so than you would think, by having to constantly explain yourself or lose connectivity with the outside world. Part of the reason why standards in projects are so important is because of that reason, that there's always going to be different team members cycling in and out. You have to interface with the market. And if everyone can get closer to the taxonomy and the standards that the entire industry is using, it's going to really grease the wheels to have more efficient plug and play on your project work. And especially for bigger projects, that's super important.
Thank you, Sam, so much for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.